Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Joe Park. I'm CEO of Horizon Stewardship. Before I get started, I want to introduce anyone who's not familiar with Horizon's free online resource library, Giving 365. Giving 365 is full of videos, ebooks, blogs, webinars, published articles, and other resources helpful to anyone who's involved in creating a culture of generosity, growing disciples, or funding ministry in your church or nonprofit organization. We're going to mention several resources today, and they're all available for free download in Giving 365. I want to call your attention to the QR code if you want to go ahead and make connection with it now. I am thrilled to have with me today Stan Reif, who's a partner at Cape & Krause, which is one of the largest CPA firms who focus solely on faith-based organizations and nonprofits. Stan and Cape & Krause are very familiar to Horizon's audience, as we've done a number of webinars with them dating back to PPP information. Stan, it's really great to have you today.
Joe, it's great to be back with you today, and really looking forward to the topic. Should be a very interesting one as we approach year end.
So before we get into that, tell us a little bit about yourself, how you came into this work, and what you do at Cape & Krause.
Okay, Joe. Well, for those that are new to this webinar, I'm actually was born and raised overseas to missionary parents and grandparents. I came to America for high school and college and thought I'd go back to our family ministry. So my undergraduate studies are biblical studies, pastoral ministries, and missionary aviation. So a far cry from accounting. But I thought I would be going back to the Amazon River and be a church planting missionary pilot. God in His sovereignty, we ended up in Alaska's missionaries, where I helped start a flying organization, served on staff at a church, and my wife and I were both educators at a mission school as well. God in His sovereignty chose to give us our oldest son, Stanley Jr., who experiences multiple disabilities. And that became that catalyst, if you will, that helped me move from being in direct vocational ministry onto the administrative side. Again, because I needed health insurance and I needed a guaranteed salary instead of raising my personal support, I ended up going to work for State of Alaska Fish and Game. And they put me through grad school, and that's how I became a CPA. And I've devoted the rest of my life really to helping ministries and churches from the accounting side instead of from the platform side. And so eventually we ended up moving to Atlanta in 2000 because of our son's medical and educational needs, and was brought to Atlanta to work with John Maxwell's organization. From there, I ended up spending almost 10 years with Crown Financial Ministries, working with Larry Burkett, Howard Dayton, and Chuck Bentley. And then I'd actually brought Cape & Krause in as the audit firm when I was with John Maxwell's organization, and worked with them when I was at Crown. So when I ended up leaving about 10 years ago plus, I ended up getting recruited by Cape & Krause to come work for them. And so I serve on the consulting side. So Cape & Krause is predominantly an audit firm, and we work exclusively in the faith-based ministry side of the accounting world, and I concentrate all of my time on the consulting and advisory side. So everything from fractional CFO and controllership services to client accounting services and other kinds of consulting engagements around software technology and compensation, strategic planning, and software conversions.
We are thrilled to have you with us. Your background in generosity development and working with churches all these years at Cape & Krause, particularly, this is your expertise, working as fractional CFOs and advising churches. As you'll recall, last year we did a webinar titled How to Budget in Times of Uncertainty. And in that webinar, we got into some really technical space. That webinar is still valid today in terms of anyone who's interested in the nuts and bolts of effective budgeting. I encourage you to watch that interview, and it is available on Giving 365, and also to draw upon Cape & Krause's new ebook, which we'll show you later, by the same title. What we're going to focus on today is a little more strategic application of the budgeting process to really build on the technical side that we spoke about earlier last year. As we do, I want to set the stage by offering some observations about the environment in which we're leading ministry today. I also want to discuss some of their impacts on making disciples and funding ministry. And by the way, making disciples and funding ministry is the mission statement of Horizon Stewardship. We really believe that generosity flows out of discipleship. So getting started, clearly the elephant in the room is the pandemic. And it's my view that COVID didn't change things in the ministry world so much as it accelerated trends which were already taking place. Today in our church world, I see kind of a bifurcation. I see churches that are leaning hard into things like shifting to a worship and discipleship strategy that expresses things like you can worship with us on campus, online, or on demand without sort of making one a preferred method, or more specifically, not making less on demand or online viewing. And it's these same churches that also tend to be leaning hard into things like automatically reoccurring giving or scheduled giving, as a lot of churches like to say. And we have clients that have worked hard during COVID to get over 90% of their gifts coming in through scheduled, automatically recurring gifts. So with these folks, predicting cash flow is pretty easy because essentially their donors have largely pre-scheduled that during the year. And then we see churches that haven't leaned into that are waiting for things to go back the way they were. And I think it's those churches who are going to be challenged as we move forward. I'm going to share some giving information hot off the press with you a little bit later that I think will begin to show the impact of some of that bifurcation. Now, on the giving front, we know that Americans continue to be among the most generous in the world, giving a consistent 2% of gross domestic product and about 2% of disposable income. And this has been consistent for the last 40 years. The result has been a fairly stable 5% rise in giving over the last 40 years. You can kind of count on that happening as Americans become more prosperous. We continue to increase our giving in relationship with that prosperity. It's not that we're more generous, it's that we're being just as generous as we were, but we have more income and more wealth as a country. The challenge has been that giving to religion has fallen from 58% of all charitable giving to just 29% in 2020. So from the late 80s, 1989, it has fallen essentially in half of the percent that is going to the local churches. Now, that's a huge number when we think about it. And what's making this possible, a couple of things. One, the falling number of households giving, especially those with annual income under $100,000. If a household's income's under $40,000, in just the last 10 years, the number of those households who are actually giving anything to charity has dropped by about 17%. Not much of a change in those households over $100,000 in income. The second, and this is driving one of those. Facts that we see in churches today, and that is about 50% of households on the rolls of churches that we go in to work with tend not to be giving anything at all. So half don't give anything. Of the half that do, half of that number giving totals less than 5% of the church's total giving, generally being less than $200 on a year. So that means that Only 25% of the households on the typical rolls in the church are giving about 95% of the ministry funding. Now, there's some things that are impacting that sociologically. One of them is the shift in wealth from the bottom 90% to the upper 10% that's taken place since the late 80s. And the last round of tax code changes and the skyrocketing stock market has actually shifted that concentration, that accumulation of concentration to wealth into the upper 1% of wage earners, which is great if that's what you have in your church. But essentially, those that have donors that are in the 90% have seen their wealth fall by 17%. Now, maybe the biggest or the most disturbing trend to me is in those upper 10% wage earners and among the church's financial leaders who are increasingly shifting their giving to other church nonprofits. And we've seen that over the last 5 to 7 years really accelerate as churches are our nonprofits really are doing a better job of articulating their case. There's so many more of them, and churches really have not reacted. And I mentioned it earlier, but Stan, just this morning, I received the initial results of Horizon's third quarter survey of churches' giving and worship attendance. Now, I'll be publishing a summary of this in an upcoming blog, but I want to share with the listeners the numbers in this report. Now, in the report itself, I actually break them down by size, geography, but this is all churches of all sizes across the entire country, year-to-date giving as reported in the first 3 quarters of the year. 27% indicated they have seen an increase in giving in 2021 over giving in 2020. 29% said it's about the same, which means that about 56% of churches are either seeing level or growing giving, but 44% saw a decrease. Now that's up sharply from what we saw in when we were measuring this in 2020. And so the number of churches that are seeing falling giving has increased to 44%, 4.5 out of 5. So that's just a quick overview of what we're seeing here at Horizon, some of the major trends that are shaping that decline in giving for some churches and growing giving in other churches. Stan, what are you seeing from your vantage point?
So Joe, certainly we're seeing very similar trends, and like they say, well, when we actually talked about this a year ago, the churches that are reaching out and engaging in community outreach and serving their local community, their neighborhoods, are the ones that seem to be growing. Mm-hmm. Those who have kind of pulled back and kind of entrenched in more of that survival mode are the ones that we're seeing certainly a little bit more contraction on the revenue side. Again, consistent with last year and this year, the numbers show the 44% decreasing, and a lot of that's because the PPP dollars last year kind of masked some of that, and then some of the expenses went down so that their net budget actually was very, very strong. This year, as churches have reopened and are worshiping in person, but also maintaining that online presence, as well as trying to work on the online engagement that's asynchronous throughout the week. That's really affected some budgets a little bit more, and some of the giving in certain areas of the country has been more impacted than others. So there are those geographic differences, along with just the church size, their community outreach emphasis, and then certainly, as we've talked before in the past, within those geographies, certain industries have been a lot more impacted than others, which affect then your membership and your attendees and their ability to give.
Stan, there's a lot of uncertainty about the economy. And in fact, when I'm going into churches, I'm hearing a lot about inflation. I'm not seeing a lot about out of control inflation as I'm doing my reading. What's your perception of that?
So again, I think, Joe, I think certainly there's a lot of politics involved. There's no doubt about that, and a lot of noise created from both sides. Certainly, there's those who are fiscally conservative. When we see a lot of the money being spent on borrowing from future years, but we see some micro elements. Whether it's the gas prices or even the proverbial milk prices. We also know the cost of living adjustments are closer to 5-6% in many areas. If you look at the federal average. So there is some effect, but it's not that hyperinflation that people are talking about, not yet. But there is some concern for that it could come. And depending on who you're listening to, which news outlet you're following, there'll be a different slant on what that could look like and how soon it might come. So yeah, certainly that creates a lot of noise in the market, and certainly as followers of Christ and churches, we all really trying to understand for ourselves, who do we follow, what's real, and what's just those trying to make a name for themselves and or sell clicks, as media or by policy.
Thank you. So let's move on to how to use budgets that build bridges with financial leaders. What a financial leader is certainly varies by church, but sort of a rule of thumb that we use in all but the very largest and the very smallest is we're generally talking about that donor group that gives $10,000 a year or more to the ministry budget of the church. Another way to think about it is your financial leaders are a group of households in your church or nonprofit who give about 50% of your ministry funding. They tend to be about 5 to 15% of the total households. So our observation is that churches and faith-based nonprofits are becoming increasingly dependent upon this group, which is often made up of the builder generation. And that's a challenge for many churches as that group begins to age. Now, in Horizon's work, building cultures of generosity, we spend most of our energy in growing the giving base of non-financial givers toward becoming financial leaders. However, cultivating and growing giving among the financial leaders remains a top priority. It will always be in our set of strategies. Stan, I've written extensively about involving financial leaders in the budgeting process, especially when the budgeting process needs to be aligned. I'd love to hear what you are seeing, and you and your colleagues at Cape and Krause related to involving financial leaders in the budgeting process, because that's really where you live in your work, right?
It is, yeah. And Joe, so let me, everything you've just articulated is, strategically accurate. The fact that depending on which data source you want to quote or reference, it normally takes anywhere from 5 to 7 families to replace that generous giver, that financial leader, if you will, that business leader, just from a spiritual maturity and season of life. And so certainly the sooner you start working on that and prepare to replace them as they age out of their giving capacity is absolutely critical. But then from a practical perspective, one thing we saw was really, really insightful and helpful about a year and a half ago was when the whole pandemic started and COVID was, became the huge uncertainty of what is it, how long will it last, what's the impact. We actually did see, and a lot of church leaders, ministry leaders, reaching out to the business leaders and together working through a strategy of how does this affect our church? What should we do? And bringing that business insight into the church world was really key. And we actually think that was a catalyst, an inflection point that kept them engaged financially all year because they were a part of the conversations. They had a lot more awareness. And I would hope that inflection point, that pivot, if you will, 18 months ago, it's continuing on, that we're continuing to include these financial leaders in the business side of our church world. And certainly, I think there's a great blending where we as ministry leaders can learn a lot from business leaders. And certainly business leaders can learn a lot from ministry leaders, and we shouldn't be intimidated by each other or segregate the other side. And so what we're finding is the churches, the ministry leaders who embrace these business leaders or finance leaders, either with business acumen and or financial resources to contribute, or a combination of both many times, are what really help propel the church into that stability or that thriving ability. That's also consistent, Joe, with what you're talking about of just discipling the donors, discipling your church membership, so you're creating more disciples and having more ministry. And those two key elements are really what's on the heart of many of these financial leaders in your community.
So Stan, the fear that I hear from church leaders, if we let our major donors in, especially those with business acumen, that they're going to railroad us, they're going to run over us, and that they won't care about the ministry, they'll just care about the bottom line. What do you experience to be the truth about that?
Joe, certainly that can be the case. We can all anecdotally point to one incident in our lives, maybe two, where maybe we reached out to the wrong financial leader who didn't have the spiritual maturity, didn't have a heart for the church. But in that case, that's a separate issue. That's a spiritual maturity issue, not the fact that we shouldn't embrace bringing these financial leaders into our mix to help us really understand. Because quite frankly, they many times that's who we go to for funding anyways. Right. So let's not kid ourselves. The sooner we get them involved, then it becomes a much better plan. We find better ways to accomplish ministry using some of these business attributes that sometimes it causes us to really find ourselves in trouble financially because we didn't listen or we didn't ask.
That's been my experience as well. If you are choosing persons who are mature and financially invested, they want to see the ministries thrive. What they may be interested in streamlining and realigning some things, but it's because they want to see the ministries grow in this investment that they're making. And so I think those are key elements. And one of the things we recommend with churches is to be very careful in the vetting of persons who are in leadership. If you let folks onto your finance or your budgeting team who are not financially generous, it is an entirely different experience than if you go the other way. In fact, our founder, Cliff Christopher, used to say that you're probably better off with a janitor who loves Jesus on your finance committee than the bank president who really doesn't have that relationship. So, Stan, anything else on that you want to touch on before we move to the next subject?
So, yeah, I would just simply say, and again, you're absolutely correct. That really, I think that the pivotal decision is finding someone who's involved, engaged in your church, and is already volunteering, is active in living out their faith in your congregation, in your community. And then the sooner you bring them in to help with the problem solving, the better the decisions you'll make and the better the funding stability you'll experience as a church. And the reality is, it's not unusual. They may actually have a passion, a unique passion that they want funded, i.e. they may be really excited about international missions trips or a particular youth kind of activity. But it's no different than anybody else in the church who's passionate about a particular area of ministry. It may need to be tempered, but it doesn't make it wrong.
Yeah, if they're bought in, it really does not only help with the funding because of how critical they are to that part, but they become powerful advocates, especially if you've done some realigning. So they tend to carry some weight with others in the church. So let's shift to practical ideas for budgeting. Again, I mentioned for anybody who's joined us late, Stan and I did a webinar that Latrice's put in the chat on budgeting in times of uncertainty that really gets into a deep technical dive on how you do that. But Stan, as you think, as leaders are approaching 2022's budgeting cycle, what do you want them to keep top of mind?
So yeah, Joe, to keep it really simple, and again, like you said, we've already covered a lot of the technical and very detailed pieces in a prior webinar, so that resource is already available. But from a strategic, where we're at today, relevant perspective, there's still some uncertainty, but we've had a year and a half of what we're experiencing as, what may be becoming a new normal. So let's take those lessons and apply those. So number one, where do you see your revenue for 2022 in contrast to 2021 or even 2020? So we've had 2 years of COVID now, if you will, from a budget cycle. Do you see 2022 continuing that trend? And if so, you want to be at 90% of where you see next year's income as far as an expense structure. Then you want the second piece, once you kind of determine what you think your top line of revenue will be, you set your expense line at 90%, so you always have margin, so you don't have to go in and do layoffs or any kind of restructuring or cut programs back. Then the next thing you want to do to keep it simple, because there is still some uncertainty of what's going on and maybe the next Delta variant, if you will. So what you want to do is you want to look at all your fixed costs or semi-fixed. Those are going to be your facilities and your staffing. And you align those, and then that will leave on a 90-day basis, on a quarterly basis, what's available to spend for ministry. And then we say, just kind of bundle that together for 90 days. And as you approach that next 90 days, you want to start with your strategy first. Let me actually back up. For all of 2022, you want to start with your strategy for your church. Where are you going? What are you trying to accomplish? What are you trying? What kind of a difference are you trying to make in your community and your congregation? Once you have that strategy, then you lay out, your fixed costs, and you have your variable ministry, direct ministry resources available, and you kind of bundle them on a 90-day basis based on how the cash flow comes in. And then as you approach that next 90 days, you'll have a better understanding of where are you with your programming, what's available to do, what has changed, how do you need to react or respond differently, and not put a lot of time into trying to figure out what's going to happen next summer, next Christmas, but rather say, here's the resources we'll set aside. And as we approach that, we'll know if we can have youth camp next summer or not. If we can, what will it look like and what's available? And not spend a lot of time, have a strategy, lay out your basics, and then on a 90-day basis, really create the detail that says, based on our strategy for the year, what's the next thing we're going to do in the next 90 days? Or on a semester basis, a lot of churches will go, kind of a fall semester and a spring semester, and then have a summer season. So whatever your methodology is, try to do your strategy around that, and then simplify your budget by, your surplus can be bundled until you have a little bit more clarity on what you can or cannot do around your annual strategy for your church based on the next 90 days or season.
So Stan, what I hear you saying is flexibility is the key, rather than creating and assuming the plan is going to stay consistent and right on track all 12 months. You're coming back and revisiting that, reallocating your budget to your giving realities, to your spending realities, to the realities and opportunities God's presented in ministry. So for some churches whose church votes on the budget, you may need to get permission when you present the budget to say, we are also asking that our leadership group and however your finance team, however you want to set that up, has permission to readjust the budget based on reality. So you're not working off a bad budget for the whole year and frustrating folks. And that may mean that you if you get that permission, it may mean that you just simply send a adjusted budget to your members and tell them what the changes were in reference to.
Absolutely. Let me give you a very simple and real example, a case study, if you will, that I'm going through right now. One of the ministry clients that we work with had some substantial changes take place. And in this particular case, it's a K-12 Christian school. And several things are taking place this fall. One is they were leasing a campus that they have now purchased. And so that really changes a lot of the expenses. It changes up their balance sheet of going from a lease to an asset plus a new loan, and they paid off some other loans, and so they've consolidated the loans under different interest rates. So that affects their cash flow. But on top of it, they used to have to pay property taxes. We're applying for tax exemption on property. That's going to save another boatload of money. Well, also this fall, they opened up another campus. So now we have additional student enrollment. And suddenly the budget we started and created last spring for the new school year is obsolete. And the comparisons are meaningless. And so we're working with the board to reset the budget for January 1, based on all the new parameters, the new campuses, the changes in capital structure, payments, and taxation issues. So now we have a new expectation of where are we and how do we think we'll end the year based on all these board-approved decisions that have made significant difference. And now, obviously, that's a little bit more pronounced circumstances for this particular client, but I think it's a great case study of the need for flexibility. So you've got real numbers and real expectations, not tied to something that is no longer meaningful.
Stan, you also made the point about budgeting for margin, that 10%. So if you expect revenues at $1 million, that you have a spending plan of 900,000, which you're revisiting. So you may have some secondary and some tertiary funding that you would like to do. You can go ahead and set those up. And if the funds come in and the trends continue to look good, then certainly you could have a plan to fund those only when resources were there. My experience is most churches are doing the opposite of what you're saying. They're budgeting more like 110% of what they expect to come in, and it is doing enormous damage to giving in the church, because it creates a scarcity, it creates a we're behind. Folks don't like to invest in sinking ships, and it's purely self-inflicted. And so I encounter that 10 times to the one who actually budgets in the way that we would tell a household to do it. Don't budget for to spend 110% of your income, budget for 90% and enjoy the margin. That brings me to a question. How much margin do you hold in a reserve? I hear, I've got an opinion on it, but what does Cape and Krause recommend in terms of a reserve line on the budget?
Yes, Joe, so great question. I would say that as a firm, as a generic, no details, across the board, we would normally say a 90-day budget makes a reserve makes the most sense. Mm-hmm. That gives you enough runway to make decisions, to identify changes and trends before you have to make severe readjustments. Now, what we will also say, Joe, was fascinating, as we entered into the pandemic a year and a half ago, there were certain churches and organizations who did not have those reserves. And they quickly got disciplined, or they may have gotten the PPP loan. And they used that to create those operating reserves, for which they were very, very thankful, and now understand and appreciate that. It was interesting that some of our clients who had, the 90-day reserve became also unsettled, and they went with 6 months. And so they added to it. And what we found, and it's interesting, I want to highlight right now, Joe, is we spent a lot of time the last year and a half trying to help everybody come up with a spending plan and a savings plan and how to create these operating reserves for the rainy day. But then we ended up talking to some of our churches and ministries who didn't have a policy on when to release those funds and how much is enough. And they found themselves in way more cash reserves than they intended to, but without a policy to be comfortable as a leadership team, as a board governance elders, to say, yeah, it's okay to spend this down to whatever level. So depending on where you're at, certainly we would say 90 days seems to be a good stewardship position at a minimum. And certainly I think maybe even last time we did the webinar, there were some additional technical insights on how to be more precise for your specific church on what that number is. And I'll just reference it quickly. It's when you take all your months across the 12 months and look at what's the longest string of months that you have operating deficits, and what's the cumulative effect of those multiple months. that becomes your operating reserve to go from the last profitable month and cash in the bank to the next one. And if it's only 2 or 3 months or for 4 or 5 months, and the amount of that deficit every month becomes that total for your operating reserves. But certainly for those churches who are finding themselves in a healthy position and maybe a little too much cash, we would highly encourage you to rethink, not necessarily just hiring more employees and spending it on yourselves at the church. But it might be, how do we really impact our community and areas of need that our neighbors are experiencing?
Because having too much cash on hand is actually detrimental to giving. Unless there are unusual circumstances, the further you get beyond 90 or 120 days, the more difficult the messaging is that we need your resources. So if you keep a large reserve, you need to have a clear plan as to why and be able to articulate that. Stan, let's shift gears now to debt and the budgeting process. How are you counseling churches that are your clients to address debt that they have on their balance sheet?
So yeah, great question, Joe. It really depends on the ministry of the church and where they're at, and the percentage of debt and debt service to their assets and to their cash management. And certainly, quite frankly, this is a great time to borrow money or to refinance. The banks are certainly, if you have the right individuals that you're working with, and the bank has a proper understanding of the church's finances. Many times that is a challenge if you don't have good financial statements, and the bank isn't able to really understand what your church's financial statements look like and mean as a not-for-profit. That can be a challenge, but it's a good time to restructure and reduce the debt service to a more manageable amount, so that the uncertainty isn't heightened by the fact that you have so much of your income being devoted to debt service. Now, the flip side is we're also working with several organizations who are saying they were healthy financially, and they're seizing opportunities for more ministry to create more disciples by leveraging the low interest rates, and they have the capacity to do so. So we've got X amount of clients who are staying put, X amount are saying, this is our time to seize the moment. We are fiscally strong and conservative and can now purchase this additional property. We have others who are saying, wow, this is the time to reduce our debt service, maybe do some consolidations and get some more favorable terms on our loan. So that's certainly a great time to do any of those above.
Yeah, we're seeing a lot of interest in debt reduction campaigns. The flip of the lower interest rate is right now, most of the giving is going to the debt service to actually reduce the principal. So that's helpful. There is where there's fear of increased interest rates. That's motivating others, but the biggest motivation we're seeing is that churches that have been carrying debt service that's exceeding 5, 7, 10% of their ministry budget are saying, listen, we need to return these dollars to ministry. And so the way that we're doing that with most churches is recommending that they leave the interest in the ministry budget, and then say the over and above giving would go directly to 100% to principal, so they can take the principal payment out of their ministry budget, freeing up ministry dollars, and then the over and above gifts are reducing that principal substantially faster. So we're seeing a really, really strong giving in the debt elimination, and that's in the culture too, because households have seen themselves over leveraged and seeing times of uncertainty, and they want to reduce debt. So they're helping their churches who are moving along that same pattern. When Horizons does a capital campaign, we help the church put together a case statement or statement of need when we do that. And it is a surprise to most churches that contact us about debt is to find out that they can actually add, I'll use the term shiny pennies, things that the church really values, ministry additions that the church really values over and above the debt. Because debt campaigns are largely supported by your committed core. If you want to get the crowd involved, especially if the debt is over a longer period of time, doing something like expanding the nursery or redoing that, or redoing your AV or your playgrounds, or expanding a ministry, that is money that will come in on top of what you would have otherwise received for the debt campaign. So churches are finding out when we test that with in a feasibility study, when we test that with their donors are saying to us, yes, we'll give you this amount for debt retirement. And then we've got a whole nother set that wasn't interested in the debt retirement, but they're all about the new additions, the expansion of ministry. So it's interesting how that happens. Very rarely is a church today just doing pure debt, because they're finding 30 or 40% more revenue by adding some of those ministry pieces that are greatly appreciated. So Stan, we've been talking about how to build a budget. Let's talk about now how to use the budget in funding the ministries of the church. It has a place in that. And let me say first that Horizons recommends a funding strategy of growing disciples rather than a traditional fundraising approach. So let's do me carefully here, because it's important what I'm trying to say. To grow a generous culture, it's most important to focus on the donor's need to be generous, not the church's need to receive. And I said, focus first on that. In fundraising, it omits that spiritual step and just makes the need, well, this is how much money we need, and this will be the impact. But when you start with helping the donor answer this question, why should I give? Then that question is largely or yields the greatest amount of increase in giving when it's set upon the donor's need to give, to be generous, to be more like Christ, to experience the joy of generosity. And our Horizons-led annual campaigns are typically seeing double-digit increases in giving, precisely because we start with the spiritual first. You don't have to hire Horizons to start with the spiritual first, but if you began with the need of the church to fund the budget, you are probably going to have a much lower outcome than if you started the other. So you have to first answer the question, why? And here's the new question that probably 10 years ago, we really didn't have to explain a lot. For the builder generation, why should I give was enough to give to the church, because that was their priority, and they were that was baked into them. But with the boomers and the Gen X's and the millennials, they are very clearly asking the question, why should I give to the church, your church? Yes, I understand why I need to be personally generous, but why do I need to give to your church? And this is where we're not, as churches and faith-based nonprofits, we are not telling our impact stories in the way that we could, so that it captivates the hearts and minds, and we look like the best investment to someone who's already decided to give, and they're looking for the greatest amount of impact. So there's a lot of resources in Giving 365 on this subject. If you're just getting started, and I'd encourage you to read this book by Don Smith. He's one of the partners at Horizons. It's called A Better Offering. 5 Unmistakable Habits of Generous Churches. And he talks about the art of storytelling and the importance of the offering talk. It may be your most important tool, the offering talk. And I see so few churches that are struggling with giving, doing a great job of leveraging that as a moment to tell the impact of their ministries 52 times a year. So that book by Don describes how to set up effective offering talks, mistakes to avoid. He goes on to talk about other opportunities for storytelling, because offering talks aren't enough. People are not attending church frequently enough that you can assume if you said it in church that people are hearing it. So you're going to have different venues to get your stories out there. Stan, I know in your work with churches, this is an important piece of the work that you do. How do you emphasize using visionaries to bring these numbers alive in the budget?
Yeah, Joe, absolutely correct. And it might surprise some people that as a CFO, as a CPA, as an accountant, that I'm going to say don't lead with the numbers. That's wrong. I mean, think about your budget at home. It's painful, to sit down and with a spouse and try to think through your budget and all the limitations on what we can't do. But if you flip it over and talk about what's our vision for our family, what do we want to accomplish? What are the goals that we have? How much is it going to cost to accomplish those things? Where do we get the money from? Suddenly, certain things just automatically drop off the list because you're focusing on the vision of where you want to be as a family, what you want to accomplish as a family, the fun things, the memories you want to create, the experiences you want to share. And so, whether it's we would love for our kids to go to college, we want to be able to retire someday, we want to be able to experience these kinds of vacations, educational ones, or just fun. We may want to own a second home or an RV, whatever it is as a family. Use the same principle as a church. What is it we're trying to accomplish, and create that ministry plan first? How are we going to make a difference in our community? How are we going to impact our neighbors? What are we going to do to create more disciples? And then as you do that, your excitement grows and the clarity sets in. And then you say, if we're going to do this, how much will it cost to do it well, to do it with excellence, to do it as unto God? Then that sets how much we need to do this. And then the numbers appear and everybody's excited because it's what we're going to accomplish. And we know it takes money, but we're not just trying to say no to stuff, or we have to say yes to this. We're going after a ministry plan that's very strategic, impactful, transformative, that everybody in the congregation will get excited and will get behind financially. Churches that do that and announce it from the pulpit Sunday mornings, every week, talking about, hey, because you gave, this happened in the community. Because you gave, we had youth camp. Because of this, these baptisms are taking place. Because you gave, and suddenly if you're not giving, you're prompted to because other people are giving and I want to get in on it. It's not that, hey, we need money to pay the light bill. Nobody gets excited about that. But when you talk about, you guys are so generous, because you're generous, this happens, the budget gets met and activities happen, lives are transformed, disciples are made.
Yeah, I heard it said, never talk about money apart from missional impact, and never talk about people's giving apart from their spiritual or discipleship journey. I think those are words to live by. Stan, anything else on these subjects before we move to the Q&As?
No, I just, obviously, as you can tell, Joe, I get excited about not budgets, but ministry plans and strategies, because that's where life transformation takes place, and then we just find a way to fund it, and that's the easy part.
Latrice, will you put the slides up? We've got a few resources we wanted to highlight for you. You'll notice the QR codes as we go through them, and I'll also start to do some of the questions. The first one is Scrap Your Boring Annual Campaign. This is a case study of 3 churches that use those principles I was talking about and saw significant increases in their giving. You can find that on giving365.com. And this is a case study of 3 churches that increased ministry funding by reducing debt. So what was the experience like? What was the process they went through to get ready? And what was the impact spiritually on the church, financially on the church? And the churches give their name. You can reach out to them and ask questions. Stan, this is your resource. Why don't you tell us about that?
So again, Joe, as we were talking earlier, this is a resource that really talked a lot about what I just shared this afternoon, as well as it also incorporates items from our previous webinar where we go into some of the technical things with a few illustrations, and that helps highlight how to practically do what we've just discussed in your church. So it's just a great tool. It's an easy read, and it should be in every church's electronic library.
My good friend Phil Estes asked this question, how many churches participated in the survey? And I think you're talking about the third quarter survey, which we bill as a 1-minute survey where churches give us answer a few specific questions around their giving and worship attendance. And this quarter, I think we had about 440. I don't have that number right in front of me, but I believe it was about 440 churches from across the country. In the report, I break them down by geography and size. So you can see, well, it's not a huge survey. It's enough that it has statistical relevance. But what's different about this than most more in-depth surveys you get is by the time Giving USA puts out their survey, well, it'll be 18 months from the beginning of the starting period. And this is, we're asking people at the end of the third quarter, what's your first 3 quarters giving and worship attendance like in comparison to the last year? So Phil, that's how we did that. Anybody who wants to put a question in here can absolutely do it. Anonymous in the survey, the survey is interesting. On average, how many financial leaders giving over 10,000 did the churches have? So we didn't specifically ask that question, but Horizons looks at the giving of hundreds of churches each year. I think Stan does as well. And generally what we see is somewhere between 5 and 15% of giving households, not total households, but of giving households. So that would be more like 3.5 to 7.5% of people on the rolls give about 50% of the giving to the church. And that would be your financial leaders. The 10,000 is just kind of a rule of thumb. But again, that depends on the size of your church. If you're a small church, you may not have many of those. So go back and use that other one. In larger churches, sometimes we're looking at higher numbers. And Stan, I think this one is for you, also from Phil. So you're suggesting using a 90-day snapshot to determine your 2020 budget.
So yeah, I would probably refine that a little bit more, Joe, and say we still suggest an annual budget. You really want to look at the snapshot for the year based on prior year trends, and maybe a 1 or 2 year look back. So you get a nice trend line of what your revenue and expenses are doing. Then you do want to go ahead and budget for the year your fixed costs, which are typically all your facilities, your semi-fixed, which are all your staffing costs, and that's going to be somewhere between 65 and 75% of your budget, because those don't change much. Then the remaining amount is what we would then say, yes, do the snapshot around the 90-day or a semester, fall, spring, summer, church season, if you will. And that's when you want to look at your programming. What can we do and do we want to do? And then now you've got the variable amount of how you want to allocate that based on a ministry plan, not just putting together a budget arbitrarily that's irrelevant and unassociated with your ministry plan.
Stan, that's all the questions we have. I want to give a quick plug to Cape and Krause. You all do something I learned about at a conference earlier this year that I'm as excited as I can be over, and that is you all come in and do a controls review in a church for an amount that must clearly be a loss leader amount. One of the strategies or disciplines of financially thriving churches is to create transparency, truth telling, and accountability. And to have somebody of the caliber of Cape and Krause come in and do an assessment of internal controls is for the price point that I heard was pretty astounding. I think that's your group that does that. Is that correct?
It is. We do have what we call our church checkups. And that's indeed what it is. Think of it as an organizational assessment where, hey, we want, you're asking us to come in and take a look, and we have really, 4 or 5 different areas that we'll take a look at. One would be around your internal controls. One could be around your financial reporting. One could be around any tax issues that your church may be having, whether it's clergy compensation and taxation. It may be any kind of UBIT issues around a coffee shop, a bookstore, or other kinds of unrelated business income. Your administrative and governance documents to make sure they're current and accurate. And then the 5th one's going to be around your church financial health index, where we'll come in and benchmark your church against your peer church financials. So those are the 5 distinct, what we call church checkups, or we're now starting to call the church assessments, where you will actually get a printed written report, digital report, with some graphs and next steps to say, here's what's working well, here are things you really need to be paying attention to, and here's some best practices that you need to consider. So it really is a great resource.
And Stan, if I was $1 million church, what range would I expect to pay for that checkup?
So each one of those is separate. And so obviously the more of these checkups you do, there's a discounted price because, there's economies of scale with some of the work that we're doing. Generally speaking, they'll start out about $3,500 for an assessment, and it can go to $10,000, $15,000 all in, depending on the size and complexity of the church and how many of the different modules you end up picking up.
So if you're a church and you've got the ability to fund something like that, this can help you stay out of the newspaper for some kind of a mistake because of lack of controls. We have had another question come in. David Dupont asked, due to PPP money, we did develop a 3-month reserve. Now we need to tap about 1/3 of this reserve to return to the pre-pandemic budget. Do you think this is advisable in hope of returning to advance giving? Stan, I'll toss that one to you, and then I'll come back around behind you.
So, Joe, since we're towards the end, and let me just have a little fun with this. Number one, hope is never a strategy. Okay, so to hope that something will be different, most likely you will have reduced that 90-day reserve to 60 days without an actual plan for something to change. So if that, if you decide to tap into that 30-day reserve from 90 to 60, that's actually a very good plan if it's part of your ministry plan to impact the community and get back to new norm. But if it isn't, then next year you'll do the same thing, and within 3 years you'll not have a reserve, and you're hoping that it'll be different, will be disappointing. So a little bit tongue-in-cheek, a little fun, but if it's a way to say we have a plan and we are fairly certain it will work, we just need capital to bridge the gap, then yes. If it's just a placeholder in hopes that something will change on its own without some intentionality or a specific program with accountability and responsibility, I would not do that otherwise.
Well, Stan, I'd say you stuck that landing. That is exactly what I would have shared a good plan if you have a strategy to grow back into that giving. If you don't, and you only have a spending plan for that money, it's likely to accelerate your decline. Stan, thank you for being here. Everybody who participated today will get a link emailed to you to download this. I hope you'll take advantage of the Cape and Krause site and of Giving 365. Thank you very much for being a part of this webinar.